We're going to pick up our story after the death of Elizabeth I. Elizabeth may have executed her cousin for treason, a crime, by the way, that Mary Stuart was probably guilty of, but Mary, Queen of Scots, had the last laugh, sort of. When Elizabeth died childless, Mary's son, who was already the King of Scotland, became James I of England, James Stuart, the first of the Stuart kings. James had been snatched away from Mary as an infant and raised by strict Scottish Calvinists or Presbyterians. This upbringing backfired on the Puritans. He ended up disliking Puritans intensely. They just didn't know how to have fun, and they did not respect bishops and authority, and James was all about respecting authority. So James remained a Protestant, but like Henry VIII, he was a Protestant with Catholic leanings. He also firmly believed in what was an increasingly Catholic theory of government, the divine right of kings. Let's watch a quick video intro. Now, this section of the video doesn't mention it, but one reason why James's court was so unpopular was that he had a number of beautiful young men serving as courtiers, and these young men had enormous power over the king. The English nicknamed him Queen James and snapped up unflattering etchings of their king with his special friends. There's an example on the right. But the video does make a more important point for our purposes. England was already moving toward a government where power was shared between the king and the legislature, and where even kings had to obey the law, a kind of government that we call constitutionalism. Henry VIII had a parliament declare him head of the church. Elizabeth I went before Parliament to apologize for the policy of monopolies and to win support. These English monarchs did not precisely rule with the consent of the governed. They probably would not have in any way described themselves as constitutionalists. They would have seen themselves as absolutist new monarchs. But by seeking the consent of the governed, they were making a move toward constitutionalism. The big problem that all the new monarchs had, semi-constitutional and absolutist alike, was getting hold of money. Elizabeth, you may recall, got into trouble trying to raise enough money to keep fighting Spain over religion, Ireland over who got to rule that troublesome island, and Holland over which country would control international trade. Under James, England was still fighting these wars, although he actually tried to end them. He thoroughly disliked asking Parliament for money, but in the English system, in theory, only Parliament had the power to raise taxes. He tried to find ways to get around this, as you'll see. But before you watch the video clip, think of what you remember about the American Revolution. You remember the Boston Tea Party? The Stamp Act? No taxation without representation, which meant, by the way, representation in Parliament. A fight over money would not only cause the English Civil War, stay tuned, but it would cause the American Revolution as well. James I's son, Charles I, had all the same problems, except for a taste for beautiful young men. This time, the fight between the king and Parliament ended in civil war. This next clip takes us up to the brink of that war. What you want to focus on especially is how an absolutist vision, that is a vision that kings made the law, indeed are the law, clashed with a constitutionalist vision. Kings ruled with the consent of Parliament, and Parliament controlled the money. Now we move to the first phase of the English Civil War. The Cavaliers were supporters of the king, and the Roundheads, named after their haircuts, were supporters of Parliament. We probably don't have time for this in class, but there is a very funny music video summary of the English Civil War, complete with singing and dancing Cavaliers and Roundheads. Ms. Jacobs will put it on Moodle. Before you watch this video clip, though, let me make one important point. Parliament was not yet a full-fledged legislature, the way we would understand it, particularly the way we would understand looking at our own Congress. Parliament was really more of an advisory body. It was summoned only when the king wanted to call Parliament into session or had to call Parliament into session in order to get his hands on more money. Parliament was also not a democratic legislature. Only the upper classes, the so-called gentry or landowners, though not nobility, could elect members to Parliament. But at this point in history, and this is important, much of that gentry was fervently Protestant or Puritan. So this war was both a fight over power between Parliament and the king, and a fight over religion between Calvinist Protestants or Puritans and Church of England Protestants, whose doctrines and rituals were still quite close to those of the Catholic Church. To complicate matters, there were actually still a lot of Catholics in England. So now the English Civil War moves into its radical phase, when the more extreme Protestants get the upper hand. Watch this next clip, which ends with the Rump Parliament condemning Charles I to death. Charles I died bravely. He actually wore a heavy vest under his shirt so that he wouldn't shiver and seem to be afraid. He gave a speech before his execution that really sums up the absolutist claim. So what is he saying here? He's saying that the people's liberty is best protected by having a strong government. And basically, you're talking about the liberty against crime, against being beaten up, against being defeated by foreign governments. But this does not mean, according to Charles I and according to absolutism, that the people should have a share in that government. The king is the sovereign, the people are his subjects. Think about the difference between the word subject and the word citizen. Subjects obey, citizens participate. So let's continue with the video. I like the way it uses the government seals to tell the story of how British politics are changing over this period. Remember what happens to this early British attempt at revolution, how it disintegrates into military dictatorship. Stay tuned for France and Russia. And think, too, about what did not happen in America, not much later. It could have happened. In 1783, at the end of the American Revolution, a group of Revolutionary Army officers actually approached George Washington and asked him to assume control of this new country. Basically, they asked him to become a military dictator, and he almost certainly could have done it. A Washington dictatorship might even have been popular at the time. Americans were scared by all the disorder around them. The economy was doing badly. It was very difficult in America at the end of the American Revolution. But Washington, to his great credit and to our good fortune, said absolutely not. And in fact, it was one of the reasons that he became a supporter of a new constitution. It's one of the most important events in America, in American history. It's called the Newburgh Conspiracy. But it shows up in almost no high school history books. Bad things that don't happen usually don't make the cut. I think they should. Before Oliver Cromwell died, he tried, in a rather king-like fashion, to make his son the next Lord Protector. Parliament said no, and indeed England would never again have a military dictator. A section of the video that we're not showing suggests that Cromwell actually vaccinated them against that particular disease, sort of like people used to be vaccinated against smallpox by giving them cowpox. Lucky British not to have a military dictator. A parliament, meanwhile, called Charles I's son, Charles II, back and made him king. Charles II was a lot more interested in enjoying wine, women, and song than in grasping power. And probably for this reason, he was actually very popular. This was a period when music, theater, and general merriment returned to England. It was a great period, for example, for British drama. Meanwhile, a bunch of Puritans left for America, where they were going to make more trouble for the British, but from across the ocean. This painting shows one of the most important moments in European history, and actually in American history as well, the presentation of the English Bill of Rights to the country's new monarchs. Parliament invited James II's Protestant daughter Mary and her husband, the Dutch Protestant King William of Orange, to become king and queen. But first, before they got those crowns, this duo had to sign on to certain constitutional limits on their rule. The Petition of Rights, or as it's more commonly known as the Bill of Rights. Let's watch one last video clip and then recap with a look at the advantages and disadvantages of absolutism and constitutionalism in England. So here first is a quick summary of the document that William and Mary accepted. Do some of those rights look familiar? They should. They are part of our own Constitution, including our own Bill of Rights. This is an American as well as European history. The so-called Glorious Revolution ushered in a long period of relative prosperity and peaceful political change. England would gradually evolve from a constitutional monarchy where the monarch still had a lot of power and Parliament was run by a few wealthy and well-connected people to what they have today, a functioning democracy with universal suffrage. That means every adult citizen can vote. The British even still have a monarch who is deeply loved and has almost no political power, which is probably one of the reasons she's so loved. This was not always an easy transition. I've just summarized a whole lot of complicated and difficult history, but the British accomplished this still without a war and without a bloody revolution. Okay, let's go back to that second essay question. We've talked a lot about Machiavelli. Let's now look at absolutism and constitutionalism. Yes, there are some advantages to absolutism. Stay tuned for Louis XIV. But absolutism, as it turns out, worked very badly in England, partly because the country had such a strong tradition of the rule of law. These were laws that even the king was supposed to obey, and also because England had a strong parliament. Absolutism also worked badly in a country that had a lot of religious diversity. Remember that Elizabeth, while supporting a national church, had allowed a fairly wide range of religious disagreement, especially if people didn't make public trouble. Though by no means perfect religious toleration, she did in fact persecute both Catholics and Puritans. Still, imposing a single religion may help build national unity. This, however, assumes that people are more loyal to their country than to their religion. It's usually a bad idea to put this to a test. Just ask the Iraqis. Well, all governments need money. Absolutist kings can usually find ways to get money quickly from a variety of sources, especially by taxing powerless peasants or forcing cities and towns to cough up revenue. In the long run, though, taxation with some sort of legal process and some kind of consent by the people who are paying the taxes, remember, we're still a long way from democracy, proved to be a lot more reliable and, frankly, to raise a lot more money. England's population was about a third of France's, and for another couple of centuries, it would still be economically less powerful. But England beat France over and over and over in wars for the next 200 years. Some of this had to do with the strong alliances that Britain put together. Some of this had to do with the fact that the British had some very good generals, although, in fairness, so did the French, especially Napoleon. Most historians think that England's biggest advantage was something that's not real sexy, was its very strong system of public finance. With the support of Parliament, England could raise and borrow money more easily than its adversaries. We're going to see when we get to the French Revolution how the need to raise money really got the Louis into trouble. And England trounced most of their opponents during this period. The one clear exception was a people even more constitutionalist than the British. That's the Americans. But absolutism, again, has its strengths as well. We move on now to the France of Louis XIV.